Well, we're going to continue the long list of giants in the field for the seminars this week. We've had some really terrific ones. The woman that's talking today is Deborah Daro, is a senior research associate at Chapin Hall, who is also the person that all of us think about in terms of child abuse prevention. She's been leading the charge to have us think and work in this area for many years. She's done multiple evaluations of prevention programs, including a number of years ago in North Carolina, we started an initiative, and Deb came in and was the evaluator for it. So she has incredible experience trying to get states and local groups and other folks doing prevention programs. And Deb is now, she's at Chapin Hall in Chicago, but we're hoping to have stronger affiliation with her here in Denver. And so we've invited her to come and talk to us today about her work in prevention. Do you want this? Or?
I think I'm going to stand up here. It's a little easier. Thanks, Jess, and thank everyone here. It's hard to be called a leader in the field when you're in the presence of so many of the mentors that have been working with y'all. I don't think you realize the collective knowledge that you've all been exposed to, and I hope you can take those lessons back to your career and build it. I wanted to start with, I know someone talked about how did you start in this field, or what did you do, and how did you want to be a researcher? And I have to tell you, when I was a little kid saying prayers at night, I never said, oh dear God, please let me grow up to be a social science researcher. It was not in my repertoire. What I wanted to be was a reporter, a newspaper reporter, and that's indeed what I became when I graduated from college. And one of my very first stories, thinking back on it, was a child abuse fatality. A little boy named Johnny Lindquist. I don't know why I remember his name, but the story stuck with me. And it was a case of child being removed from the home, put in a foster home. They had a hearing about 6 months later. The judge decided Johnny should go back to his parents, even though the foster parents were in court saying, really, I mean, he comes home from visits with bruises. You cannot send this child home. And they did. And within 3 weeks, he was in the hospital in a coma, and he died 4 days later. So much of his case stuck with me, because we're talking now 1972. So this was before there was federal child abuse legislation. And there were 3 characteristics of that case that I would hope we would do better today. Characteristic 1, the worker's skills and the kind of supervision the worker was getting. The fact that this was a case where the supervisor was not a child welfare worker, it had been farmed out to Catholic Charities. So there was one step removed from the agency and the worker responsible for the care. Secondly, the judicial insensitivity, the inability for the judge to listen to the foster parents because he said they have no standing. I don't care what they say. I'm not here to listen to them. And then third was when Johnny died, the police immediately arrested his father because, of course, the father was the one that had done the abuse. But here's the follow-up to that story. A few weeks later, police were called to the home again. And it had been because one of the other children in the home had fallen out of a window and had multiple broken bones. As the police did the investigation, they realized it was never Johnny's father. It was indeed Johnny's mother, who was still in care of those kids. So I hope that when I think about this, it wasn't the reason I went in to do child abuse research, but it was something that struck me that there's got to be a better way in which to protect very young children. So I have an operating hypothesis that governs my work right now. And it's that child protection and family support systems will be most effective and efficient when they're built on a universal platform that assesses the capacity of all parents, offering each of them the level of assistance commensurate with their needs. In other words, we need to recognize that there's a level of struggle in raising children that is universal and exists across all families. It is striking to me that we mandate assistance to families when they fail, but we don't seem to have any social acceptance or a collective responsibility to help families from failing. And that part of the reason we do that is that we have not had a strong linkage between how we think about preventing an issue and how we think about treating it. What the main things I want to focus on is to talk a little bit about a little background of history. As you get older, you talk about history more. Recent history of child protection, it's really the tale of two systems. One's prevention and one's child protection. Secondly, that we struggle to find an optimal balance across the goals of child safety, child development, and parental autonomy. I'd love to take credit for that, but actually Larry Aber said that to me last year. And as we talked about it, we realized you can't optimize those three things. I mean, you can't, but what you can do is you can't maximize the three things, but you can optimize the mix. And how you think of that mix has a lot to say with how we structure child protection systems and prevention efforts. And then finally, I think the current environment is particularly a moment at which there's an opportunity for change. So let me start with a little bit of a historical background on things. I'm going to give you three brief snapshots. One is a progressive era policy called the Shepard counteract, 1921. Those of you that are familiar with health know that legislation. The second is thinking about the modern child welfare system, which goes from about, I'm taking the 1960s to the present, and then the development of child protection services. Henry Kemp was a central figure in both the prevention and treatment of child maltreatment. And again, we owe him a great deal of credit for being aware of the issue and for moving forward on it. These little snapshots are not going to be totally inclusive. I'm not going to tell you everything that ever happened. It's a snapshot, and it's a snapshot with my camera and my lens. So there's probably things I've missed, things I've overstated, things I've interpreted in some ways to make it fit my reality. And if anybody has any updates to this, brother, I'd love to hear about them. Because I'm not doing this because I think it's the absolute truth. I started on this exercise because I think to learn where you're going to go, there's value in spending just a little time thinking about how you got to where you are. So let's start with the Shepard counteract. Was passed, I said this at one of the mentoring meetings, Harry Truman once said that the only new things in the world are the history we don't know. And I didn't know about this act until one of the fellows that I work with through a fellowship program I operate raised it to me. She was a historian. She was the first historian in our Doris Duke Fellowship program. And she'd been writing about this. And I was struck by it. It was passed in 1921, and it was a very spirited debate about the role of the federal government in human and health services and the role of government in general in telling mothers what to do. It was a very ugly battle, and it reflects so much of the battle we have now in our healthcare system. The American Medical Association thought this is an attempt to socialize medicine. The best quote I found on this that I just love said that it was an attempt to remove children from the care of their parents by turning control of the mothers of the land over to a few single ladies holding government jobs in Washington. There is a lot wrong with that sentence. I don't want to parse it out. But the second thing to keep about it was a pretty modest investment. It was every state got $5,000, that'd be $70,000 in today's terms, and they got a little bit more money on a competitive basis if they were really interested in it. Overall, the funding was $1.4 million, and every state, this funding went over for a 5-year period. If there were only 3 states that didn't adopt this, I bet you couldn't guess what the 3 states were. I was surprised. It was Massachusetts, Connecticut, and my home state of Illinois. The other states did do it, all of them putting in place a maternal health system within their state. And it really was kind of the early block grant concept. States got this money to, some of them did home visiting, some of them did pamphlets, some of them held conferences, some of them did actual structural improvements in their community. And it's important to realize that the other element of this, states were held accountable for what they did. There was some sort of early notion that you have to give us data on how you spend the money, and we're going to see what happened. So what happened on this? Actually, there is some evidence that it did move the mark on infant mortality. There was a study done in Rutgers by 2 economists, and they figured that this piece of legislation accounted for about maybe 11% of the decline we saw in infant mortality during this period. The important part of this, and the reason that the act intrigued me, was that it was universal. It was given to every woman. All she had to do was be pregnant and need services. There was no differentiation about, we'll only give it to poor families, or we'll only give it to families that present some difficulty. It was that there's benefit with everyone getting this kind of assistance. There's benefit in establishing a common language of what it would be to be a parent and what it would take to raise a healthy child. Now, some of the advice they gave was pretty terrible, and I won't go into it, but it was of the science at the time. But the important thing is that people felt a common sense of ownership as one publication noted, that people talk proudly about raising their baby in the government way. Can't imagine anyone saying that today, but it's a sense of, we're in this together, we're all here. Regrettably, the act was not reauthorized. To the credit of the American Academy of Pediatrics, pediatricians walked out of the AMA meeting, set up their own association, because the AMA continued to fight this legislation. After all was said and done, no one talked about this kind of help, direct help, federal help to parents and young children. And when it resurfaced afterwards, it was through the AFDC and the New Deal program, where again, we started focusing just on poor families and poor children, as if those were the only ones that needed any assistance with their parenting. The second historical snapshot I want to spend some time on, thinking about child protection policy. CAPTA was a big battle, but it was the battle that really said, is we're going to do something for just poor families, or are we going to say child abuse isn't owned by any group? Child abuse is income neutral, if you will. And that's exactly how this was promoted. The legislators that did this didn't want another poverty program. They wanted something that would address the issue of maltreatment, and they saw that it was something that could happen in any community. There were no limits in some ways. Henry Kemp's work was essential in doing this and really promoting the legislation and making people aware of it. The legislation established mandatory reporting laws and a state child welfare system that really influenced, a federal policy that influenced state child welfare systems across the country. I think as we think about the child welfare system, it's safe to say that it has vacillated between wanting to take children that are at high risk and put them in care, protect them from their parents, versus wanting to be supportive to parents. And over the years, we've gone back and forth and back and forth and back and forth on this idea of, do we want to fix parents and avoid placement, or do we want to find permanent options as soon as possible? The Family Preservation and Service Act, which grew out of a whole series of other reforms that predated, is something we really need to keep in mind right now. That this is a real attempt on the part of child welfare to look deeply into the prevention field, to say, what could we do to be a little more upfront? What could we do to better protect children before they show up on our doorstep? In fact, Jerry Milner, who is at ACF now, has described this as, we need to change the focus of child welfare to primary prevention of maltreatment and unnecessary removal of children from their families. We should prioritize the importance of families by ensuring that when foster care is necessary, it operates as a support for the family rather than a substitute for the family. Great goal. I'm not sure I would ever think of your local child protection agency as the primary prevention agency in a community. I think it's not that the child welfare needs to take on this role, but rather child welfare needs to partner with the people that have been doing it. Before I go talk more about the family first, I want to give you just one little other brief thing, and that's the child maltreatment policy snapshot. Dr. Kemp also was an advocate of prevention, but not just a reporting system. He talked about early home visiting, and it was in his mind an expected, tax-supported right of every family, along with fire protection, police protection, and clean water, societal services that we all deserve to have and from which no one should be excluded. His home visitors, by the way, were mothers, because they would know how to help their other mothers in the community take care of their children. Our history in this field is way behind what was going on in child protection. Indeed, what was interesting to me is The Battered Child, the seminal textbook on this topic, didn't include a chapter on prevention till its third edition. It was at that point that I think Henry and Ray Helfer thought there was enough going on in prevention that we could really write about it, and that was in 1980. The early history in prevention I have described as 1,000 flowers bloom. It was the polar opposite of evidence-based. Anything worked, anything. If you thought you had an idea and you thought it could prevent child abuse, by God, go out and get money for it and then do it. And so we had a variety of things, from safe at home days to parent education programs to public awareness messages, a lot of things that went on. And we never really were quite sure what our impacts were. In the 1990s, I think the field began to focus on what I call one flower, early home visiting. Everyone suddenly thought, well, what we really just need to do is give everybody a home visitor. It was a response in many ways to a perfect storm. One of the students was asking me about this, and the thing in the home visiting field, it was a mixture of things like the basic research on brain research that said, whoa, guess what, first 5 years of life are important. Most people knew it, but now they had science behind it. Secondly, there was good, credible evidence that home visiting could work, thanks largely to David Olds and his colleagues, that showed that if you provided early home visiting, you could reduce rates of maltreatment. And then finally, I think the practice community itself had come to terms that we can't do everything for everybody. Let's pick a population and try to make it work. I've talked about this as the imagery going from a horizontal imagery where everything works to something vertical, where if you really want to make change, you start at the basis and you start with families at the very beginning of life. We were going well in the prevention field, kind of doing it all state by state, community by community. And then in 2005, the federal investment came in the form of the Maternal, Infant, and Early Childhood legislation, McPhee. It infused 5 billion, not million, in early home visiting across all 50 states. It was initially a 5-year program. It has now been extended for another 5 years, maybe a little longer if the advocates have their way. And while the federal government has been a blessing in distributing and making home visiting a far more common investment than it ever was before. It was around, we were doing it, no joke. But McPhee brought it to a lot of communities that didn't have it and expanded the number and range of programs that were available in each community. So you didn't have just one home visiting program, you had maybe 2 or 3 different kinds of programs to suit a family's specific needs. All of this was very good. It also gave us a set of standard outcome measures. Home visiting should focus on these kinds of criteria about parenting, about child health outcomes, about maternal health outcomes, about child safety and the like. The problem with the federal investment, though, it has now begun to think that home visiting can fix the most challenged families, that we can work with families that are facing the most difficult circumstances. And I think the one question that remains is how far can voluntary programs go in really engaging people in services? Can we really reach those families that are at greatest need? I think of this sort of conceptual, sort of schematically, as the caseload mix between child welfare trying to go more on the prevention end and prevention trying to go more into the at-risk end. And now we have this shared space where both entities are saying, what could we do to increase our success with families? So we are at a point that I've called an inflection point. The current system continues the myth that only some unlucky children and their parents need collective assistance. That's the system we have. But the system we need to be thinking about is changing that dynamic so that it's not one agency working with one side and one working the other. What could we do to collectively support these children? We need to begin to think, too, of this system that we have that continues to focus on fixing parents, as if we just fix parents, everything would be fine. That the problem in this issue and the things that lead to child maltreatment are not the things in the context in which we live, but it's in the individual families. And if we can fix the individual families, we'll be fine. Our challenge, I think, is linking the current fragmented systems of public and private, voluntary, mandatory, into a coherent response that directs the most costly and intensive services to those that most need them. That is really our challenge. And right now, we need to start working towards addressing that by reforming and working collectively within the context of an integrated system. So let me talk a little bit about what an integrated system looks like. And you heard some of this from Christy the other day. The importance of integration. It does create a more comprehensive response to complex problems. It shares child well-being across multiple sectors. That's a good thing. It increases efficiency. An integrated system directs families to the most appropriate and effective services that they need. And I think it can improve outcomes. It can maximize the potential of both prevention and intervention to impact core outcomes. Now, it is clear to me that the data on this last point is still emerging and a lot more needs to be said. We have a notion that this will work, but we don't have really hard, fast data that we can indeed turn it around and make it happen. There are significant barriers to thinking about integrating prevention and child welfare. let me talk about some of the barriers from the prevention perspective. Child welfare doesn't operate, child welfare, big child welfare, not child protection as in CPS, but child welfare in general, doesn't operate on the same basis like a health system, where prevention is part of the everyday practice. And this is an example, again, I gave to the mentoring class. If you think about precancerous cells, you show up at your doctor, you've got some precancerous cells. It doesn't result in costly chemotherapy or radiation, but neither does a doctor tell you to go away until you have stage 4 cancer, then come back and brother, have we got a treatment program for you. Basically, they sit down and they start to explain about what prevention services might stop you from getting stage 4 cancer. That's not what really happens in child welfare. If you think about it, we do an investigation, nothing's there, we send the family away if we don't provide help. We're basically saying, but come back to us when you failed, and then we'll be there to help you. It is true that even in the medical case, you can refuse prevention services, right? But it's, to me, the way the doctor talks about and outlines for families the course in which this situation may evolve. Yes, you're right now, you're not abusing your child, you're not neglecting your child. But let me tell you what kinds of things might happen if indeed we're unable to provide you the support and help you need. At that point, I think there's a discussion where families are able to engage in the notion of fully understanding where this is going. And you can increase the voluntary nature of services when people will open up and say, no, I can see this. I can see how what you're doing now is going to help me in the future. It's a lot about also parents, I think, accepting the responsibility of having to care for their kids, not in a dictatorial way. But our responsibility socially is to give parents the help they need. But then parents have a responsibility to act in ways that are supportive and helpful to their children. And I think we can set that up in a way in which it's not an either or. It's not a sense where people are going to feel put upon, ostracized. It's set up in a sense where if you think of prevention as a gift and not as a demand, the perspective is very different. I often say you're walking down the street and somebody stops and offers to give you $5 as opposed to ask you for $5. You're probably feeling a lot less put upon when they're giving you something. And so much of the prevention issue is being able to offer that level of assistance and help. So from prevention providers, when they think of engaging in child welfare, there are really philosophical differences about prevention and acting before a parent fails. But also, I think for prevention service programs, they often feel they'll lose control over their population. They'll lose control over their services because child welfare is such an enormous system. They will flood them. They will take the service slots they need, and they won't have any slots left for other families. I think there's also a potential for the partnership from prevention's perspective that they could get tarnished if they go too close to child welfare. They're the good guys. The prevention people are the ones that are there to be supportive, and the child welfare mission is one that's less acceptable. But from the child welfare perspective, there's also been difficulties in trying to form any kind of relationship and interaction for a couple of reasons. First, up until the time we had home visiting services available in many communities, the truth was prevention was pretty diffused. You didn't know what it looked like in a community. You didn't know where to go to for the services. You weren't sure who was going to be at the table, who you're going to interact with. What this new focus on early childhood has been, there is a body of programs and services that the child welfare system can relate to now in a more appropriate and systematic way than it was in the past. We've historically lost financial and political incentives for child welfare to be too preventive, to think too far upstream. I think the Family First legislation is changing that, but prevention is not a billable expense as placement often is. And then I think we can respond to the response to victims of maltreatment is mandatory, and primary prevention is not the primary mission of child welfare agencies. So there's a sense of where, yes, they will partner with prevention, but there's also some need to remember that there are trade-offs in this exchange, and they need to essentially still be responsible for the kids that are going to need their most intensive services. So why do I think it's an inflection point? I think the dissatisfaction with the child welfare system is high. Like this, many of the people you've talked with this week, there's a lot of things happening in the child welfare system that people are concerned about, would like to see operate better, and are finally in a place to really begin to make some changes. Child abuse is not obvious or predictable, and reported cases can suffer outcomes comparable to substantiated cases. There's not a sense that it's just the substantiated cases, much of the stuff that Emily was talking about. And prevention efforts now offer more consistent partnership opportunities, particularly for children 0 to 5. When I think of the evidence-based programs that are available that child welfare has already embraced, based on the kinds of research we have about early child development, programs like Safe Care, Family Connections, Child First, elements of Triple P, all of them are programs that really in many ways allow child welfare to work more intentionally with families while children remain in their homes. That they're family-focused services. They're not services just to take children away. It's a way in which we're learning that we can work with families even when they're terribly distressed, facing a lot of challenges. There are interventions that can really make this work, both for families that are in particularly difficult circumstances, but also the idea of innovations for pregnant and parenting foster children, which is one population where I have to say I've really been amazed that there hasn't been more work done early on with foster children that are pregnant or parenting. If there ever was a population that would scream out for additional support and services, this is one population, and we're finally developing evidence of support to do that. And then we're also developing some good interventions. Healthy Families America has a demonstration in Illinois to work with homeless families. So all of these kinds of things, putting more clinical services within child welfare to better work with families while children remain with their parents are good. But I kind of think of this as sort of a little window dressing, a little bit about remodeling, a little bit about kind of just doing small cosmetic things. And maybe there is a time now where we need to go to really new development, kind of really a major rehab. I watch HGTV and they always have demo day. And it's sort of the idea that, is there something that we need to tear things down? I personally didn't think you would ever tear down a load-bearing wall, but that is not true. You can. You just have to do a lot of things to substitute for it. I think the same could be said about much of what we own dear about the current child welfare system. What if we were to do things a little bit differently? What if we were to approach the problem differently, provide different incentives to staff? And that's sort of what I want to talk about when I talk about building a new foundation. That much of what we've done has been small, minor changes to the child welfare system to make us a little bit better about keeping children, either not taking them out of their home or keeping them in care a minimal amount of time. Or we've gotten a little bit better about strengthening parents so that we don't have as many repeat reports of child maltreatment. But I'm not sure we've done anything to really move the mark. And one of the reasons I say this, when I look at the child fatalities in this country, the child abuse and neglect, they're still largely young children, very young children, under 5, under 3. And most of the prevention work we've been doing to date has really been trying to find families to avoid that worst possible outcome. And all the work we've done, there's been no decline in serious maltreatment or in really child fatalities for the youngest children. So if this focus was only about just doing targeted prevention programs with families we identify as being at risk with young children, given the growth, not unlike what Des was talking about with the shaken baby, you would think that this would be beginning to make a difference on the most serious cases, and it is not. So it says to us, brother, this targeted idea, the idea of just trying to come up with a set of characteristics and limit our prevention efforts in the way that we limit our interventions in child welfare cases, that parents have to demonstrate some overt need for them. That's the only reason we'll ever say anything to them, is if we see these kind of red flags coming up. That's not getting the job done. So I think of this new foundation as something that really needs to build on a universal system. This is a circular debate. I'm sure you've all seen this. It's a sense of going from targeted to universal. We start with targeted programs. We think they're stigmatizing. We try universal. Then we think it's inefficient because we're spending money on people that don't need it. We go back to targeted, and we get into this mindset as if these two sides of the equation are opposite, that we have to do one and not do the other. And that's kind of crazy. So what we try to do is really begin to what if we integrated it, wonder if we built it within a coherent system, which I have to say, the state of Hawaii, when they did their early start program, and Henry started it, what had a universal component to it? They met with everybody in the hospital, every new parent, and they tried to identify those families that needed more intensive targeted programs. But everybody got some contact at the hospital. Now, Hawaii had a medical system that allowed them to give a medical home to every birth in Hawaii. Many communities don't have that, but they instinctively knew that this wasn't an either or, we just needed to do it in a better way. The limits of the targeted approach I've touched on already, and Emily's presentation was great, and I love the way she talked about being able to use predictive analytics to identify kids that are at risk for foster care placement. But when you start labeling other kids as low risk, then I say to myself, well, they're at low risk for foster care placement, but they're not at low risk for good developmental outcomes. Again, think of the three things we're trying to balance: child safety, child development, parent autonomy. That's putting emphasis on one variable, on the safety variable, perhaps at the expense of opening up services at the developmental level. We assume that these risk models can identify everyone that's at risk. We assume that the highest risk will engage and remain in services. I can tell you from my own research that is not true. People don't stay in 2-year program, 5-year programs. And if you think about it, someone comes to your house and says, I'd like to come every week for 5 years to visit you. I mean, I can see how that's a little off-putting. I could see why someone, when you think about behavioral economics, where we only have so much bandwidth on what we can tolerate, this looks like it's overwhelming. This is too much. I can't commit to that kind of thing. And so something like this, I can see why the highest risk families don't stay in the program for as long as they potentially may need. I do think it also maximizes the potential for stigmatization. To change this by less targeted, more on a universal base, I do think we can get out of this merry-go-round, if you will. Benefits of a universal system, and we've talked about universality, in my mind, a lot about doing assessments, and the programs I'm going to talk about in a minute are programs that focus on the first few years of life, on newborns and their parents. But I could imagine a sense of checking in with families at multiple points in their lives. I think every time a child goes to middle school, Dick and I were talking about this, somebody should sit and talk to their parents and say, your children aren't going off the deep end. It's okay, it's normal. You know, no 12-year-old is adorable. It just happens. And you have this conversation with families, again, to normalize the experience they're having, that those are worthwhile conversations to have and move forward on the trajectory. The benefits of universality, I think, over and above what it does for outcomes, is I think it galvanizes individual needs into a single coherent call for reform. I think we right now know what this family might need or that family might need, but if you ask all new parents what they need, and you sort of document the issues they're raising, the needs they're expressing concern over, you have elevated the parent voice in this. You've created, and I believe you could create quite a substantial demand, documentation for what in real time, what new parents are telling you they need in order to meet the needs of their children. So it'd be parents telling you, not people like me or really you. I mean, the sort of the thought leaders, the talking heads of the world that seem to speak for parents and say, we know what parents want because our research tells us what they need. We understand how children develop. It is good every once in a while to ask the people you're trying to help, what are they thinking? Where are their needs? Where are their most pressing problems? And we would then begin to think about where we would direct our prevention resources. But most importantly for me, this kind of thing creates a notion that all children are viewed as appropriate beneficiaries of our concern. It says we can't predict with any certainty which parent isn't going to face some issues. We want to break down barriers where the notion is that if you're a parent, you don't ask for help because you should be able to do it. And the parents that ask for help somehow are deficient, somehow are missing the mark, somehow just can't cut it themselves. And I think when you do that, you do minimize the ability of people to effectively use prevention, which, remember, depends largely on people accepting, offering, being open to the possibility of assistance. So when I talk about the benefits of universality, I am not talking about everybody getting the same thing. It's really a sense of, if you had a conversation with families about what they needed and you offered it to them, you linked them to existing services, told the community what services you needed, and if there weren't sufficient services, you'd build political will in order to ensure that those services developed. That's how you create a change, a more supportive environment for families and children. Is this like pie in the sky? Is this like too awful, nobody will ever do this? Well, not true. Actually, it's being done. And the issue that I had put in the reader, the special issue we did on Future of Children released in May, the volume itself includes a number of examples of programs that are really promising. There are programs that are being done universal. There are programs that have been subject to rigorous research. And guess what? They're doing really well. They're having impacts. Durham Connects, which was developed by Ken Dodge and his colleagues at Duke University, has been operating now. They've done 2 randomized trials. They've done several quasi-experimental designs. And in their first randomized trials, they found a 39% fewer child abuse and neglect reports by age 60 months, by the child's 5-year birthday. They followed them that long. That's a pretty dramatic drop in child maltreatment reports. And I'll say a little bit more about this. Is it because people got a single home visit? Or is it because these programs opened a door to families? And once they opened the door and they walked through, they found themselves having access to services they wouldn't have had otherwise. So is it just the opening the door? Or is it making sure that when the door is open, there's services available for families? I can't tell you which it is. I mean, Durham's a pretty service-rich community, but I can tell you that those families that didn't have the door open not only did poorer on these and the idea of emergency care use, but they also did poorer on a lot of the family measures that they were targeting. They were less likely to use referral services. They were less likely to have access to early intervention programs for parents and the like. So there's something about this opening the door process that produces pretty dramatic reductions in 2 areas that are not only suggest children's outcomes are better, but also these have pretty strong cost implications about what they're saving in terms of both emergency care use and child abuse reports. Welcome Baby is a program in Los Angeles County, the polar opposite of Durham Connects. Durham County has 5,000 births a year. LA County has 150,000 births a year. Durham County has 2 hospitals that deliver 90% of all the births. Welcome Baby we're working in 14 hospitals right now, and we're getting maybe 20% of the births. It's far more diffused, economically diverse, ethnically diverse community. But even here, they're finding that families that get the visit in the hospital, followed by a visit by a nurse in the home that does a series of assessments. The Welcome Baby program, unlike Durham Connects, which is a single visit, followed up by referrals, Welcome Baby works with the family for the first 9 months. So there's about 6 or 7 contacts, some home-based, some on the phone, for families in the Welcome Baby program. But they're also, they did see higher emergency room rates, but they saw better well baby visits. The moms were more likely to receive postpartum visits, and they saw fewer second pregnancies at 36 months, as well as a number of other family outcomes that I haven't included in here. So it's a different model, different setup, but in both of these, the option exists to identify families facing the greatest challenges and then refer them on to services that are more intensive. It might be intensive home visiting programs. It might be services for domestic violence, substance abuse, whole range of other issues, mental health services. It may be access to something as simple as childcare. It may be a way of connecting families to the informal supports that exist in their community. But what they're able to do is provide a platform in which, in these communities, people now find it acceptable and welcoming to have someone say, you've had a baby, how's it going? What kinds of things do you need to be successful as a parent? The First Birth program in New Mexico is less intentional in reaching out to every first birth, They make it normally available that if you're having a baby, your baby for the first time, is first pregnancy, we will provide you services, and they reach out to that through the hospital. They're also seeing reduced emergency rooms in the first year, and they found children were less likely to use pediatricians 9 or more times, which some have criticized that finding. Some have said, well, why don't you want them using pediatricians? And they were saying they felt that there could be an overuse, that now they're creating a sense of appropriate use of medical services for the families in their program. So, can this work at scale? I mean, these are pretty much, even though they're programs that are well done, well organized, growing. Family Connects is now in 40 different communities around the country. Welcome Baby is expanding to other hospitals. First Birth is going to other communities in New Mexico. There's a sense of expansion, but can we really go to scale? And what would it take to put in place this universal framework that I'm talking about? I think there are real challenges to making this work. Not the least of which maybe you have to keep in mind that in Los Angeles County, the little factoid that I love is they have what's called Family First. It's a dedicated entity funded with tax-supported dollars that has to focus on services for 0 to 5. What a novel idea. I mean, I keep thinking if learning begins at birth, why don't our education dollars or taxes like we use for education dollars begin at a time a baby is born? Why do we wait until they're 5 or 6 years old? Like that's the magic age where we suddenly have a universal concern for the education of kids. What if we did that? So in LA, they do have a taxing district. But I would argue that any community has some advocate, some agency, some situation that they can begin to build this system of support. But there are indeed some challenges, some organizational and some structural and attitudinal barriers. Structural, organizational silos exist, and the agencies that work with families continue to have a very narrow framework about their job. We can talk about increasing it by doing cross-agency work and the things, and everybody loves the ecological model. State governments are not organized under the ecological model. It's lost on them, that theoretical concept that we love and we believe really is an important variable to think about how we address issues of child maltreatment in this country. The truth is you still have your health department, your welfare department, your educational department. One of the best lines from this, I was meeting with some people in Illinois, the Department of Children and Family Services and the Department of Human Services. And they stood up and said, we are working together. We've got a lot of joint projects, but you know what? We stay in our lane. And I thought, well, if you're staying in your lane, what do you wave by each other as you go down the highway? I mean, it is still a sense that agencies want to be held accountable to what their agency does. They don't want to share in a common set of objectives. So organizationally, we still have a situation where the vision and capacity of state agencies remains quite narrow. I think we have a dominant policy framework continues to be on fixing families, not reforming systems. We continue to believe that it's the family that's the unit of the problem, the crux of the issue. It's not the context in which we live. And I would ask all of you just to reflect a little bit about the communities in which you're raising your children and what resources you have and don't have. When I was a new mother, one of the evaluation projects I was doing was in the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago. It's an evaluation of the precursor to early Head Start called the Beethoven Project. I would go into that housing project and all I could think about was if I was here trying to raise a baby, it'd be a hell of a lot more difficult than my situation that I have. The support that I have. If I want to go to a doctor, I drive my car, I pull in the parking lot, I make an appointment ahead of time. She's there, we have a conversation, everything is fine, as opposed to getting on a bus, taking your child to a clinic where you may have to wait hours for it. Those are fundamental differences in how people are able to raise their children and the supports they have. And the more we keep focusing on just the families, that it's only the families, it's the only thing we have to worry about, I think the further and further behind we get in really making measurable change. The final structural barrier, I think, is the replication process is difficult. We know that one size does not fit all, but we really wish it did. We would be really happy if we didn't have to worry about variability in staffing, variability in timing, variability in fitting a program to a family's specific needs. We would be just as happy if everybody needed the same thing. Just as people need one kind of shot to get cured, we'd be happy if we could just give them that parenting boost shot and everybody got it and it was all fine. We don't have that luxury. It's not that simple. I also think we have some attitudinal barriers that continue to limit the progress we can make. One is that the belief that parents, not the collective, raise children, which means that there's no sense of support that we have to give to children outside our own sphere, because parents are responsible for kids as opposed to all of us being responsible for kids. And I think we do believe that the only way to make progress is to find the families that are most troubled and give them extra support, and everything else will be just fine. And that's how we'll resolve social problems. I think with all of this, it's an important thing to think about shifting our mindset from one of scarcity to abundance. The Institute of Health talks about this with their 100 million healthier lives. Thinking about the resources you have, not just financial resources, but within communities. When we work in early childhood, we often use the phrase nurturing human capital. That's why we're working with young kids. We're nurturing human capital. I like to think of these universal services as unearthing human capital. Wonder if when you went to visit, you not only asked what families needed, but also a sense of what can you give? What is it in your sphere? Are there people in your community that you'd like to connect to if you have what you need? This idea of building connections to people, and that the solution is not just more public service programs, not just more dollars through public service programs. It's a sense of ownership in which people feel responsible for the community in which they live in. You can see this. This is it's a slide that John Paul has used a number of times, and you can easily see the problem here. Universal in our context is not giving everybody the same thing, but it's giving people what they need. The issue is distributing not just equality, but equity. Equity, giving people what they need to be able to see over the fence, to be able to accomplish their objectives with their children. Dismantling or minimizing organizational and attitudinal barriers, I think, require a couple of things. We need to refine the problem in ways that cut across populations. And this is the issue. When we think of the most at risk, the kids going to foster care, then we got a problem that's 5%, maybe, I don't think it's even 10% of the population. There, universal doesn't make a lot of sense. But if the problem is providing support to families to adequately care for their children, and that we're going to trying to maximize child well-being, child development, we're putting the emphasis on the child development side of the equation, then I think the level of need may go up to 80, 90% about families that could benefit from some kind of intervention. When the problem is, when the issue you're trying to resolve is 80 or 90%, then targeting stops making sense. There needs to be some universal outreach and reach to all families. And at that price point, then it makes sense to be thinking about universal. So how you define the problem, what you set up as the frame you want to use, the frame around the worry, as we used to say in planning school, that allows you to begin to open up opportunities. And in child protection, even child abuse and child maltreatment, I think that that's something we need to be thinking more about than we have done. I think we have to see that the evidence base that demonstrates the universal approach is better over what we're doing and can elevate parental capacity in meaningful ways and actually address population level outcomes is important. And if we can do that, I think that would be another way to move the mark on things. That universal services offer important infrastructure for doing better both with families as well as systems. If we want system reform, we've got to give everybody a common base for signing on and for accepting what they need to do. If these models work as intended, I really think a universal platform, biggest impact is going to be found in how systems operate, as well as what we see in terms of families. So if child welfare were to think of moving in this direction, what are some of the questions they need to ask? Key decisions. They have to decide where they want to prevent foster care placements or prevent the need for contact with the child welfare system. That's the first question people have to ask in the family, I think, in the Family First Initiative. We need to be thinking about determining when voluntary offers of assistance are insufficient and build a culture of acceptance. I think we have to set expectations high. Elizabeth Sawhill was talking about reinstating a universal year of service for everyone. And she said, you know, you establish a structured opportunity to do the right thing for people. You put it out there. You don't force them. You don't say they have to do it. But once the structure is there, they begin to move towards it. and creating opportunities for parents to act in ways that will better care for their children. It's still voluntary, but you've expanded the number and range of opportunities families have. I think you have to establish shared decision-making rules and minimal standards for parent support across agencies and across populations. Everyone's got to be kind of on the same page in terms of what you're going to take on and who's going to take the lead on it. Some kind of common workforce standards, some ways in which if you're going to work with families, here are the criteria you're going to need to follow. And whether you're working with families that are at highest need or families that are at minimal risk, there's still a sense of respect and listening to taking the parent's lead that has to be in place in all the work that we do. We need to use data to begin to galvanize public support. And I think we have to play the long game. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. You talked about different outcomes, John, about what domain you're in. It really is this idea as you focus on proximate outcomes or distal outcomes. Value to proximate outcomes is twofold. One, it tells your funders you're kind of on the right track and that they're getting what they want sooner than later. And secondly, it does give you a sense, an early indication of when you might want to need to modify your services and move in different ways. Are you on track or not track? So you need to have both. But if the long-term objective is really population level change, that's probably not going to happen in the first year or so of your investment. It's going to be something that's longer term. When Henry talked about universality and the idea of providing support to children, it was for him a question of justice. He said, by the same token, we must now insist that each child is entitled to effective, comprehensive health care, and that when parents are not motivated to seek it, society on behalf of the child must compel it. It seems incomprehensible that we have compulsory education with truancy laws to enforce attendance, and yet we do not establish similar safeguards for the child's very survival between the ages of birth and 8. That there's this big gap we have where we haven't set up any social expectations about what we as a community will provide for families other than to say parents will do it. But we can't ask parents to do something if we haven't given them the resources to do it. And that awareness, I think, is going to be able to drive policy going forward. This is my last slide when I think of it. I have absolutely no idea how all these pieces fit together. I wish I could tell you I did. I will tell you the little guy at the front door there, I used to have that as home visiting because I thought that's it. They'll all get a home visitor and that will bring them all into all these other services. But I've come to believe that's the wrong door. The first door is this idea of a universal platform. The idea that we will ask all parents, what do you need? How are you going to do it? And how can we help you? And if you have resources to give, how can we link you in with other people in your community so you can help that reality occur not just for your family, but for all the families in your area? And that's all she wrote.
Thank you, Debbie. You have 5 minutes for questions. Questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Thank you for that very thought-provoking presentation. And I have a comment and a question, and my question you may have addressed because my brain was stuck on earlier slides. So my comment is about, well, I really appreciate that you talked about different developmental periods, potentially also needing support for parenting, and also about the intervention strategies to prevent unwanted pregnancies among foster youth. Because that's for an older population, and I do work with older populations. This is a comment, there was a paper that was published in the last couple weeks by Harvard economists. Have you seen this? Have any of you seen this? Looking at investment in social programs, and one of the findings was that the investment in programs to benefit youth are effective at any age. So I just wanted to throw that out there. It's not just early childhood in terms of their economic analysis, which is super exciting to me, who works with older kids. But then my question is about the 3 or so programs that you put up there, the universal ones. My question is twofold. One is, and again, you may have addressed this, if they are universal programs, were they equally effective at engaging populations along what we might call a risk spectrum? And second, in terms of moderating or subgroup effects, were there some differences, and for whom the benefit was greatest?
Great questions. In terms of access, the penetration rate in all of these programs is pretty high. And I was telling someone earlier, and Durham Connects, the classic example is that there's two groups of people that were less likely to apply, although they were very small in number. Group one, woman pediatrician married to a heart surgeon who doesn't think they need any help. Okay. Then there was the other extreme, living in a trailer park in the northern part of Durham County, not wanting anybody there. They're making progress in both of those, but both of them were relatively small. It is universally accepted. Welcome Baby, the same thing. They have very few people that say they don't want the family to come, particularly around the nurse visiting. And this is an interesting thing. If Welcome Baby discovers through their screening in the hospital that you're at very high risk, they will want to send you to a more intensive home visiting program. Or the other option is to stay with their low risk. And initially families were saying, well, will I get my nurse? Will the nurse come to my home? And they said, well, no, you're going to go to this other program. They said, no, we'll take the shorter program. Because they essentially wanted that visit from a nurse. Durham Connects is a nurse visited program. And I don't think every home visit has to be done by a nurse. But what I'm learning from this research is there is something when it is a medical provider going to the home that people place a value on that they don't value. So sorry, social workers. It's just not seen as the same thing. Although I was telling John, and I was so excited, you did this thing in the lobby, in the courtyard where people got coats, the white coat service. When was the last time anybody did anything like that for a social worker? When was the last time they said, welcome to our profession. Welcome, you're so wonderful. We want to recognize you. We want to tell the world that you're part of this uplifting, great profession. So that's just a side. But I just came away thinking, those folks are going with a spring in their step because they are now special.
They'll be depressed within
3 months. Yes, that's right. They'll learn how bad it is. But your other differential, Durham Connect actually looked at that. Whether you were high risk or low, you got the same benefits on their outcome measures, which were largely, they were parenting, and they did an intent to treat model. So it was, how was your parenting? How was your, did you use referral services? All of the kinds of appropriate. There was actually no different initial assumption of risk. So the program universally has benefit. And I couldn't agree more with you about the older populations. If we think of this as being, we're kind of putting kids on an escalator, the escalator shows up where there's nothing on the next floor. And that's been part of the problem of prevention too, which is another talk that we've spent so much on the first 5 years of life. We forgot 5-year-olds become 6-year-olds and then 7-year-olds, and we haven't done as good with that. Sure.
Other questions?
Oh my gosh, Dick wants to go.
We got to get back.
We do have, so speed mentoring is coming. Just to reiterate, the mentors need to leave now because you need to be ensconced in your position. And the mentees need to wait and talk to Dan, and Dan will tell you where to go and how to get there and who you're with. Thank you. Thank you, Deb. That was great.